All right, now it's time to move to our special guest today, Right Honorable Tony Blair. It's great to have you again taking part in another IMPROVATE International Conference. You personally and the Tony Blair Institute are heavily invested in improving life and advancing Africa in all areas. It is an honor to have you with us today. So how do you see the role of technology and innovation in making globalization accessible to all?
Globalization's a fact, and even with COVID and some of the political reactions against globalization, the world's going to carry on integrating. And technology's got a huge part to play. It's got a part to play because it's partly driving this globalization. But it's also because if you want globalization to work for people, you've got to learn how to master the technology, harness it, and use it for the good of the people. And the technology revolution, it's the single biggest change that's going on in the world today. And it's going to transform and is transforming everything, the way we live, the way we work, the way we think, the way we communicate and interact with each other. So to make globalization work, you've got to make technology work for people.
Well, IMPROVATE is all about finding solutions and sparking collaborations between governments and tech companies in order to improve the quality of life for people around the world. How do you see IMPROVATE's contribution toward achieving this vision?
One of the biggest challenges for governments and countries, particularly in the Africa context, is you can see these technology developments happening around the world, and many of the people inventing the technologies and developing them are people who are passionately interested in operating in different parts of the world, and often particularly in Africa. But the challenge is how you link those with the ideas with the people on the ground who can help make them happen in continents like Africa. So in the African context, you have countries that could really use technology for financial payments, for health, for education, for issues to do with the security of the citizen, for the efficiency of government, the development, for example, of biometric identity, which I'm sure will happen across the continent of Africa eventually. But many of the people developing the best technologies are outside of Africa. So the question is, therefore, how do you link the two? And that's where IMPROVATE comes in, because it's because of its connectivity, it's able to put together the change makers with the policy makers and with the people on the ground who can help make it happen. And this will also, by the way, help in the development of Africa's own technology sector, because over the last 5 or 6 years, Africa itself has started to develop some really exciting technology companies. You will find today venture capital from the West investing in Africa in a way which a decade ago would just never have been on the cards. And again, all of it requires facilitation and connecting. And this is where IMPROVATE comes in and does it so well.
Mr. Blair, what are the major challenges in Africa today as you see them?
So the 21st century is going to see Africa take its proper place in the world. But right now, Africa is in a state of transition. So it has a population growing faster than any other part of the world. The population of Africa over the next decades will double, become a continent of over 2 billion people. Its middle class is set to double just in the next 5 years. And Africa faces challenges of development and poverty, access to electricity and therefore to technology, and of course, challenges of governance. Now, my institute works particularly on the governance side. In my view, the countries that are well governed today are the ones that succeed, because everything else is mobile, but your government's not. So if your government is operating effectively and well and honestly, you can succeed in today's world. If it's not, then it's much harder. So the challenges of Africa are multiple, but one of the things that's important for the world to realize is that you just take the issue of climate change, for example. A whole lot of international discussion, quite rightly, about how we accelerate our development of the measures to combat climate change. But without involving the continent of Africa, as it develops and as it needs access to electricity, to travel, to communication, without binding in Africa to this global picture, we're never going to succeed. So Africa is important in its own right, for its own people, but it's also important for the world. And the challenges of Africa are multiple, but I am optimistic about it. If you look at Africa today and compare it with Africa, let's say when I first came to office 25 years ago in the UK, Africa's come a long, long way. It's got better quality of leadership, better qualities of business. Its social links are much, much more developed. And, you know, as we were saying earlier, the technology sector, for example, in Africa today is really coming on. So Africa's at a very, very exciting moment of development, and smart countries are investing in Africa today.
Well, satellite communication enables communication without ground infrastructure. How do you see the advantages of satellite communication in Africa to meet these challenges that you have just mentioned?
So one of the biggest challenges that Africa has is to overcome its natural disadvantages. And its natural disadvantages are around, for example, the size of the continent, the fact that many rural communities are very isolated, you know, sometimes hundreds of miles from nearest centers of urban activity. And therefore, what that means is that to try and, for example, hook up the electricity grid to some of these remote areas is incredibly difficult. Now, fortunately, technology comes to our assistance here. So a lot of African villages are now using off-grid or mini-grid electricity facilities, and satellite technology gives us, again, a huge opportunity to bridge some of those land divides. So I think that properly deployed, satellite communication can be absolutely transformative for Africa, and it can allow it to leapfrog a whole generation of old technology and get to new technology. So this is incredibly exciting, and I think that there will be enormous interest in Africa in how this satellite technology can help with connectivity and communication. And there's an interesting parallel with the technology around solar, because going back 10 years, when people like myself were first talking about bringing solar power to remote African communities, frankly, people were pretty skeptical. They thought that it wasn't really going to be possible to do. At that time, the economics of solar power weren't so great either. But this is what happens with technology. 10 years on, the costs have come down, the technology's advanced, and now this is very possible for remote Africa villages. So I think satellite technology is one of the most exciting areas, and one of the areas where if there is the right interaction between satellite companies and African countries and their governments, this can really advance things.
Mr. Blair, can you describe for us how you see the importance of this conference in exposing African nations to the opportunities in advanced satellite communication?
One of the problems when you're in government is you're busy with a whole lot of things during your working day, and you're dealing with crises and scandals and events that are unexpected or even expected, and you're dealing with the day-to-day politics and business of government. And so sometimes one of the problems is that you don't have the time to step back from the daily grind of things and look at what are the opportunities that, if you're aware of them, you can use to your advantage. And so the advantage of a conference like this is by bringing together people who are developing new ideas with policymakers, the policymakers can get some sight of the exciting opportunities that technology can bring. And one of the passions of my institute is to try and bring these change makers and policymakers together in a better dialogue. And the IMPROVATE conference is it's a great way of making those connections. Because, when you think about the opportunities to transform, for example, healthcare and education, just take those two areas alone. If you've got the right means of communication, there's no point in many of these developing countries, particularly in the continent of Africa, going through building all the legacy systems of countries in the West. Instead, they can use technology to bypass a lot of those legacy systems and develop the most up-to-date forms of communication, allowing you to do, for example, remote healthcare and education to a much higher standard and better degree than any basic and rudimentary school or health system can achieve in the old way. So the advantage of a conference like this is it helps those policymakers understand how the world's changing and how, with a bit of vision and imagination and focus, they can access those changes for the benefit of their country and their people.
All right, Mr. Tony Blair, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Lauren. Thank you very much indeed for having me at the IMPROVATE conference. It's a great pleasure to have been with you all, and good luck to everyone participating. I think this conference is a great idea, and I'm sure it'll be very successful. Thank you all.